I'm Kevin Bryan. Will and Sarah have quite nicely introduced the problem of firm failure. It's incredibly common. Actually, some of Will's stats blow my mind, even as an economist, how frequently big firms fail. So we're going to step it up just a little bit. I'm going to talk about how you can cause your entire industry to fail. And I don't mean a small, antiquated industry, right? I'm not talking about a stagecoach driver. I'm not talking about fax machine manufacturers. I'm talking about industries like artificial intelligence or self-driving cars or personalized medicine, industries that are at the frontier of the technology of their day. And I'm not talking about industries that don't get support. I'm going to talk about an industry where the firms in that industry spent an inflation-adjusted $40 billion US on research and development alone. And governments in North America alone more than matched that amount. And yet within 25 years, the entire industry was gone. They sold no products 25 years after spending this money, right? Now the industry I'm talking about, of course, is nuclear power. So to understand how it was that in the early 1950s, this was widely seen as the future of the energy industry, yet from 1977 until this decade, there were no new nuclear plants started and finished in the United States. To understand how that collapse happened, we need to head back to the early 1950s and see what choices were being made by firms. So in 1954, we made commercial nuclear power in a test plant for the first time. It's actually done in the Soviet Union, but soon after in the United States. And you might think, oh, well, we know how to make nuclear power. What other choices are there to make? Let's just get the cost down and get it out. But in fact, there were a lot of choices to make. So if you look at these turbines, to understand why they're there, we have to understand how you make nuclear power. The way nuclear power works is that you've got an atom of fissile material, something like uranium-235. A free neutron hits that atom. It becomes unstable. The atom splits into two nuclei, some radiation spits out. But importantly, a couple free neutrons fly out into the air as well, and some kinetic energy, some heat is produced. Now those free neutrons will be flying around, and if I have just the right amount of density of other fissile material, more uranium, more plutonium, then those neutrons will hit another atom of uranium. That nucleus will split, and we'll get a chain reaction going. If we have just the right amount of fissile material, we won't cause a nuclear bomb, but we will generate a lot of energy. Create some heat. We'll somehow turn that heat into electricity. And the way this type of nuclear plant works, this is called a light water nuclear plant. It's about 80% of the nuclear plants in the world, is that heat is going to heat up water. The water is going to flow through some pipes. The pipes are going to turn water into steam. Steam is going to turn a turbine, and now we have electricity. All right? Now that's certainly not the only way to take a nuclear chain reaction and generate electricity. So lots of choices had to be made. For instance, do I use uranium? Do I use plutonium? Do I refine it? Do I use water to get that kinetic energy into electricity? Or do I use a gas graphite plant or an aqueous homogeneous plant or a molten salt plant or all the other potential technologies that were being considered in the early 1950s? It wasn't clear exactly which of these would be the best. Obviously, a lot of research needed to be done. But if you looked at reports from the early 1950s from the Atomic Energy Commission in the United States, which had some of the best nuclear physicists in the entire world, it turns out in the early 1950s they said light water plants have some of the lowest potential for long-run efficiency and safety of any of the nuclear power plant technologies we're considering. So this plant that now makes up 80% of the nuclear plants in the world was considered in the 1950s a poor long-run bet. And when some economists in the 1980s looked ex post at the realized plant efficiencies, they agreed that 1950s idea was correct. It turns out that this, for a variety of just pure physics reasons, is not the most efficient way to develop a nuclear plant. So you might wonder, why is it that the industry developed this plant that turned out to have costs and benefits that don't lead to a long-run nuclear industry? Why did firms like Westinghouse and General Electric, Babcock and Wilcox, Union Carbide, Dow, Gulf Oil, I mean, these aren't small firms. These are well-run firms. Why did they put so much R&D money into this kind of plant and not something that had better long-run potential? So there's an idea in economics called dynamic increasing returns. Dynamic increasing returns means the small events in the past can have large outcomes in the future. A great example of these dynamic increasing returns is the early days of the automobile. If you look at this automobile I've got here, you see a bunch of smoke coming out the back. There's nothing on the tires. It's a steam engine in the back of the car. This is a car called the Stanley Steamer. Turns out the steam engine driven cars were very common around the turn of the 20th century. But what do you need for a steam engine? You don't need a gas station. You need some way to get water into your car. The main way they put water into the car was they just stopped at farms where there were troughs of water and loaded it up as you drove down the highway. At the time, it was more of a dusty road. But in a lot of parts of the developed world, it was not that hard to find water. Now, in the very early days of the car industry, foot and mouth disease had an outbreak in New England, which was one of the centers of the auto industry at the time. And in order to prevent foot and mouth disease from spreading through the agricultural community, a lot of cities banned having water in these troughs that was publicly available. This, for a very short period, about a year, made steam engine-driven cars sort of less valuable. And you saw a lot of people in that year purchase internal combustion cars. Now, the more internal combustion cars there are, the more gas stations there are, the more mechanics there are, the cheaper the cost it becomes to make more internal combustion engines. And so this minor event, this outbreak of foot and mouth disease, put the nail in the coffin of this technology, steam engine, that in 1914 it wasn't obvious at all which technology, internal combustion or steam, was going to win out for the early automobile. So that's just bad luck. But it turns out the problem of dynamic increasing returns can affect industries that aren't affected by bad luck but make bad choices. So what I've got here, you'd be maybe surprised. Does anyone know what this is? What's in this picture? Darlington what? It's the Darlington nuclear plant. It doesn't look anything like The Simpsons. Where's the big turbine, right? That just looks like an Amazon factory, something like that. So it turns out in Canada, a lot of the nuclear plants are what's called heavy water plants. So rather than use just regular water through some pipes to create steam and turn a turbine, they use something called deuterium, which is fairly expensive. They tend to use a different refinement of fissile material than a light water plant. Just another way one can build a nuclear plant. And it turns out the heavy water plant was considered by experts in the 1950s as a technology that had quite a bit of long-run potential if we put the resources into it. Now, why didn't we? Well, it also turns out that we were a lot further away from being able to develop usable heavy water plants in 1955, 1966. So the first heavy water plant doesn't open until the 1970s. Now imagine that you're General Electric. You're trying to decide what kind of nuclear plant should we throw our engineers at. And you see everyone else is working on light water plants. Light water plants turn out to be pretty quick to take from the technologies that existed in 1955 to something usable. Okay? So all your rivals are working. They're going to, in 1962, 1963, they're going to be able to sell nuclear plants. Safety regulations are going to start developing around light water plants. Engineers are going to begin being trained on light water plants. So what do? You put all your money into heavy water. Maybe the regulations that exist make it so you don't even know if you'll be able to sell your plant legally, even if you do develop it. No. You go right in, develop a light water plant, and hope that you'll be able to generate efficiency gains in the future to make it more and more profitable. You don't really care about the fact that your development of light water leads to engineers being trained on the wrong type of plant. You don't really care that your development of light water makes it harder for other firms to build on your technology and create a successful long-run industry. In fact, it gets worse. What if all the other firms in the industry, the Westinghouses and the Union Carbides, have been developing plants that look like heavy water? You knew this in 1955. Man, now your incentives to develop a light water plant are even greater. Not only will you have it to market in 1962, you'll be a monopolist for a decade, right? So no surprise, firms respond to incentives. Firms generated these dynamic increasing returns not because of an outbreak of foot and mouth disease, but because of their own incentives. Their individual firm incentive was not aligned with the overall industry incentives. And so once we have these first light water plants, it becomes very, very difficult to switch because of the way complementary technology and trained human capital and law has been developed around the initial technology. Now, this isn't just a history story. This happens with many technologies today. So artificial intelligence, of course, a lot of the important techniques, what's called deep learning, were developed right here in Toronto, largely by this man. His name's Jeff Hinton. He's a computer scientist at University of Toronto. He's also the head of Google Brain at the moment. And he just gave a talk here about 2 weeks ago where he said, you know what, you're all using my technology, something called back propagation, and it's probably a mistake. You can't generate general intelligence using this technology. We have to go down a different road, things like capsule networks and other types of techniques he's looking at, where all the money and all the investment that the Googles and the Ubers and the Teslas and the Apples have put in to deep learning may actually not have been useful in generating the sort of general artificial intelligence technology that we all think is going to be super important in the future. So what can you do then? How do you avoid going down the wrong technological path when it's in every firm's interest to do so? Well, what you have to do is you have to align the interests of individual firms with the long-run interest of the industry. And you can do that without violating any antitrust rules. So what you can do, for example, is create an industry-wide research contract. So in semiconductors in the 1990s, a lot of big semiconductor firms in the US created something called Semitech. The idea was, instead of wastefully duplicating certain new technologies among our individual research staffs, or instead of following research lines that are bad for the industry as a whole, we're going to coordinate our research efforts to try to advance the industries. But that turns out to be legal under antitrust law. You can make sure that you don't see the lucre of free money from the government for research spending. You have to understand that free money is going to bias your research towards certain kind of research. So the government says, this year we're going to give you X amount of dollars if you work on, say, artificial intelligence. That's going to affect the type of technology you pursue because it's something you have to finish within the year. So free money and outside money is not necessarily a good thing. So in general, in a quickly advancing technology where there's dynamic increasing returns, you have to be very, very careful about following your firm's own incentives. Your firm's own incentives can lead the entire industry to fail. You don't want artificial intelligence to become the next nuclear power. Thank you very much.